Hey everyone, it's Amy. Thank you all for your overwhelming positive response to the first Q&A video. I will keep trying to make these to tackle questions that are harder to address in the comment section. Also, I can't get to every question in one video, but please don't feel ignored if I didn't get to yours in this one. I will try my best to tackle them in future videos. And also, some of these topics can probably be expanded even further into a longer form video. So definitely let me know if there is a topic that you want to know more about. Now, let's jump right in. Okay, the first question asks, in C-dramas, when a nobleman was found guilty because of a big crime he committed, he was either killed or exiled, and his family members were also either killed, exiled, become commoners or slaves. Was this true in real life in ancient China? Or there were also other punishments that we don't know about? Yes, punishment for family members were a real thing, but it really depended on the severity of the crime. The highest form of punishment is generally known as the 9 familial exterminations, 诛九族, or sometimes also referred to as the extermination of 9 clans. This punishment meant that the execution would include 9 layers of kinship. In slightly less extreme cases, the punishment may not be death, but it could still apply to multiple layers of kinship. Now, your follow-up question might be, what does 9 layers of kinship mean? Well, it's a little bit more complicated. Generally, the first layer includes the 4 parental clans. Everyone in your family that has the same family name as your father, or sister of your father that are married and their sons. Your own sister that are married and their sons. Your own daughters that are married and their sons. And then it includes 3 maternal clans, or clans of your mother. Your mother's father and his family members. Your mother's mother and her natal family members. Your mother's sisters that are married and their sons. And lastly, it includes 2 spousal clans, or the clans of your wife. Your wife's father and his family members, and your wife's mother and her natal family members. This type of punishment for family members is due to a concept known as 连坐, or guilt by association. This is because a family was seen as a unit, meaning that the honor of one member was the honor of all, and the crime of one member was the crime of all. It was the family's duty to control its members. Now, this severe punishment of large-scale execution became less common by the late Ming Dynasty. So stripping of title, seizing of property, and exile to remote regions became a more common punishment. But execution of family members still could happen, although it was more commonly limited to 3 layers of kinship instead of 9. These 3 layers generally meant your parents, your brothers, your spouse, and children. An interesting story is that one time in Ming Dynasty, the emperor was so upset that he ordered the execution to be of 10 layers of kinship instead of 9. In this story, Emperor Yongle had just ascended the throne after the Jingnan Rebellion and asked Fang Xiaoru, a famous scholar official, to draft the Ascension Edict. Fang Xiaoru refused and claimed that the Emperor Yongle was an usurper and did not have the right to the throne. Obviously, Emperor Yongle was so furious that he threatened to exterminate his 9 clans. And Fang Xiaoru stood his ground and retorted that he would not draft the edict even if the emperor exterminated 10 clans. So in the end, Emperor Yongle classified Fang Xiaoru's students as his 10th clan and executed a total of 873 people. This was the only instance of an extermination of 10 layers of kinship, or 诛十族, in recorded Chinese history. This one asks, is ghost marriage, posthumous marriage, common in ancient China? Are there any instances of it? So yes, ghost marriages, or Minghuan, were a very real tradition in China, more common among commoners than nobilities or within the imperial palace. Families arranged them so an unmarried person wouldn't be alone in the afterlife. Documentations and records of ghost marriages would go all the way back to the Han Dynasty, with even some accounts from the 20th century in rural China, unfortunately. I believe if you Google Minghuan in Chinese or ghost marriage or Chinese ghost marriage, you might even be able to find some very disturbing photos from the late Qing Dynasty. I don't recommend doing that before going to bed. The next one asks, Did all the women in the Forbidden Palace have their feet bound? So the Forbidden City during the Ming Dynasty was run by the Han Chinese, and foot binding was definitely much more widespread in the imperial palace in those times. However, not all women had their feet bound. Palace maids most likely did not have their feet bound as they needed mobility, and feet binding was extremely popular among the nobility and elite of the Ming Dynasty. So most consorts probably did have their feet bound. We don't know for sure if all consorts had their feet bound. It was not clearly documented that it was a requirement, but it was very likely. Also, consorts from other countries, such as Korea, would not have their feet bound. In the Qing Dynasty, foot binding was strictly banned for Manchu women and largely frowned upon by the Manchu rulers for the Han Chinese women. Women with bound feet were strictly forbidden from entering the Qing Dynasty imperial harem, so we can assume that there were no consorts with bound feet in this time period. This one says, I'd love to know more about the selling people issue. For instance, kids were a property of the family that they could sell at wish? What about human trafficking? Was it legal? To buy a person from the human traffickers gives the buyer legal rights? There were no laws protecting the people from being kidnapped and sold? Yes, the sad reality is that children in ancient China were under the absolute authority of their parents. Not quite like properties though, as they were not treated as objects, but it was more like children were expected to do anything their parents needed them to do. The selling of children is usually done through a contract known as a 卖身契. Adults, including parents themselves, can also be sold through such a contract. A person could be sold to become a servant or even a concubine. And freedom could be bought by purchasing back the contract, usually at a price multiple times higher than the original purchase price. I briefly talked about this contract in my brothel video if you're interested. The buyer could also often choose to sell the bought person to another. This was technically different from being a slave, as the contract often limited what role the purchased person was allowed to fill, and the owner was not legally allowed to kill the bought person. This was also distinctly different from the human trafficking or kidnapping people, which was illegal. Specifically, the act of kidnapping was illegal. But unfortunately, the reality is that enforcement against kidnapping and selling kidnapped people was very weak, as it was often difficult to prove the source of the bought person. And once a person was sold into a powerful household, it was incredibly difficult for them to challenge their status, as the buyer held the contract and the social power. Magistrates often prioritized the property rights of the elite buyer over the testimony of the person who had been sold. I had a question. Why did so many families not want their daughters to marry the emperor? Wouldn't it be really good for the families? I saw a video where someone said people used to hide their daughters or they would pretend to be ill. Why? So this really varies across the dynasties and really depended on the ruler at the time. But it was definitely a real concern for some families, because on paper, marrying the emperor sounds like an ultimate honor, but in reality, it could also be a nightmare. And palace life was full of restrictions and could be filled with harem rivalry. Even if palace intrigue was not quite as intense as what we see in modern C-dramas, competing for the emperor's attention was still a real requirement. And the many benefits that a family might gain from a daughter that enters the imperial harem can only be realized if the daughter actually gains the emperor's attention. And also, once a girl enters the imperial harem, she lost her freedom and might never see her family again. And if she fell out of favor, it could even bring harm and shame to her family. So for the Ming and Qing dynasties, some families would hide their daughters or claim that they were sick during the imperial draft. Instead, they preferred choosing a more normal but stable marriage outside of the imperial palace. This one says, in C-dramas, the royal physicians always make their diagnosis based on the person's pulse rate. Is that true? How often were they correct or incorrect? So pulse taking is a very real technique that is a core part of traditional Chinese medicine, and it's still practiced today. When I was younger, I had to go see a doctor that practiced traditional Chinese medicine, and that was exactly how they did it. Now, I cannot speak on how accurate or inaccurate this technique is, but just know that it is a real technique that is still practiced. However, the reality is that pulse taking was probably not the only tool that they used. Traditional Chinese medicine primarily utilizes 4 methods: 四诊, inspection, 望, looking at the patient's complexion, body, and tongue; listening and smelling, 闻, listening to the patient's voice and breathing; and noting their body odors. 问 inquiring, asking the patient about their symptoms, history, and lifestyle. And finally, palpation, 切 feeling the patient's body and taking the pulse. So in reality, it's probably a much more elaborate process. And the next part says, I'd perhaps like to add to the same question the constant talk of the prenatal qi that is mentioned 100 times over in Empresses in the Palace. Did they really talk that way? And was there a difference in views between the learned doctors, the courtiers, and the common folk? Are traditional treatments like acupuncture and poultices perhaps omitted from the dramas simply because of nudity-related propriety? Or for some other reasons? I'm under the impression that they were commonly used by the traditional medicine doctors. And yes, prenatal qi is a real concept in traditional Chinese medicine. However, I think in the context of Empresses in Palace, the English subtitles simplified the terminology for the audience. Because the actual translation for prenatal qi is 元气, which refers to a person's vital life energy that they inherited from their parents at birth. But if the consort was pregnant, then the term that they were referring to in the drama was probably 胎气, with tai meaning fetus, which represented the health and stability of the fetus and the pregnancy itself. As far as the different views, the actual doctors were, of course, the experts, and consorts and common folk could echo some medical concepts, but would defer to the doctors for their judgment. Acupuncture, poultices, and tonics were definitely a common part of traditional Chinese medicine. I don't know why they're not shown, maybe because the drama is not centric to medicine, so introducing such a scene could be confusing. So it might be for narrative reasons or censorship reasons, as you suggested. Okay, this one asks, I'm curious, if someone wanted to join the army, do they have to have a specific background? And how do they rise in the ranks? Also, were there more forbidden love stories? Very curious to know. And if you had to pick a dynasty to wear for their fashion, what would it be? Okay, I'll answer these in order. For the army, it really changed depending on which dynasty and time period it was, so I'll try to use a more general answer. So first of all, peasants and commoners could always be conscripted into the army. This was especially common during times of unrest and chaos. And the method of a conscription and the terms of military service would vary depending on the time period and the ruler. Sometimes a peasant would join the army because they would otherwise starve. In the earlier dynasties, the higher officer positions within the military were usually limited to the noble families. And that's because leading armies and performing well was an important way for noble families to further their own power, wealth, and influence. But the Ming and Qing dynasty tried a different approach by establishing military households, which was supposed to supply the bulk of the standing military. In the Qing dynasty, we saw this through the eight-banner system, which I talked about in another video. But as I mentioned earlier, conscriptions of peasants still happened when more bodies were needed. As for the forbidden love stories, if you're referring to imperial harem, yes, they definitely existed, but they were incredibly dangerous if discovered. Punishments were brutal and often involved the execution of everyone involved and sometimes even their families. But I think this might be a topic for a longer video. And if I had to pick a dynasty for fashion and harem vibes, I'm going to have to cheat on this one because I cannot pick just one dynasty. I'm going to go with Tang Dynasty for makeup because they have the most interesting eyebrow shapes, and also I love the Hua Dian. I would then pick Song Dynasty for the hairstyles because I love the pearl and the floral mix in the hair ornaments and also the crowns. For clothing, I would pick Ming Dynasty because I love the Diyi, which are probably the most luxurious ceremonial robes for court ladies. These robes were technically invented in earlier dynasties, but I think the craftsmanship really peaked in the Ming Dynasty. This one asks, my question is, which one is your favorite Pokemon? Clearly, the most important question. And I hope this isn't some secret personality test, but if it is, you have to let me know the result of my test. So my husband says I remind him of Psyduck because I can mind control him, and because I used to do this when my head hurts. But personally though, I've always had a soft spot for Snorlax. Something about eating, sleeping, and just vibing feels very relatable. Okay, that's it for this time. Hope I got to answer some of your questions. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked today's video. If you want to support this channel and help me uncover more fascinating stories from Chinese history, please check out my membership and become a Noble Baoban. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.